Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're checking in from. My name is Aaron McKean, and I'm Senior Legal Counsel here at Campaign Legal Center. I'm glad I can welcome you to How Democracy Vouchers Make Elections More Inclusive, a conversation with Jen Heerwig and Brian McCabe. Thanks all for joining us. For those of you unfamiliar, Campaign Legal Center is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that's dedicated to solving the wide range of challenges that are facing American democracy today. We fight for every American's freedom to vote and participate meaningfully in the democratic process. And we believe our democracy should be transparent, accountable, and inclusive. Now, to do a little bit of stage setting for today, we do have to go back to 1972 when the Watergate scandal exposed President Nixon's campaign corruption in his re-election campaign. And that led Americans to demand more transparency in our election process. And along with that, it also included public financing as a model for improving our elections. As running for office becomes more expensive and more challenging for new candidates without wealthy networks to depend on to finance their campaign, public financing has emerged as a solution that increases representation and inclusion in state and local elections. Now, in their book, Democracy Vouchers and the Promise of Fairer Elections in Seattle, it's this one right here, the authors Jen Heerwig and Brian McCabe examine the promising case study of Seattle, which adopted a public financing program in 2017 that's called Democracy Vouchers. Now, this is a unique one. There are a number of different models, and we'll get into that during our talk today. But Seattle really took the bull by the horns in terms of trying something new. And Heerwig and McCabe explore the important lessons that we've learned from Seattle and from other municipalities that have adopted or are trying to adopt public financing. We'll be joined shortly by Jen and Brian to dive deeper into the history of the Seattle program and how democracy vouchers work. But before we start our discussion, I do have a few housekeeping items. So during the conversation, please do use the comment section on LinkedIn or YouTube, wherever you're checking in from. Submit those questions that you have for members of our panel. And then at the end of the panel, we can start that question and answer section. We'll do our best to answer every question, but in the interest of time, we may not get to all of them. If we're not able to answer your question today, and you are a member of the press, please email your questions to media@campaignlegal.org. And if you're a member of the public and we're not able to answer your question today, you can email your questions to info@campaignlegal.org. And with all that out of the way, we can turn towards introducing our guests. First, Jen Heerwig is a political sociologist who studies American politics and campaign finance, and she's an associate professor of sociology and political science at Stony Brook University. Her research includes Seattle's Democracy Voucher program and how public financing initiatives affect representation in local elections. And then second, Brian McCabe is a Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of Sociology at Georgetown University, where he also serves as the Director of Undergraduate Studies. Brian's research focuses on several urban policy issues, including low-income housing programs, municipal campaign finance, neighborhood change, and historic preservation. Thank you, Jen and Brian, for joining us today to share your expertise on public financing. I think the best way to do this is just to jump right in and really get to kind of the story that you're trying to tell. So, this book tells the story of how Seattle became the first municipality to adopt a voucher-based public financing system for local campaigns. But I want to know why did you want to tell this story?
Sure. So first off, I want to thank the Campaign Legal Center for having us today. We're so pleased to be here to talk with all of you, and especially to the Campaign Legal staff for making this event possible, and to Erin for moderating. So why did we want to tell this story? Well, first of all, this was the first time a book had been written on the Seattle Democracy Voucher Program, which is the first of its kind, both within the United States or in any liberal democracy around the world. It's a really new, novel, and potentially transformative way to do campaign finance. The idea for it had been kind of floating around in the legal scholarship for a couple of decades, actually, before Seattle took up the project of actually implementing a democracy voucher program. So we wanted to really preserve the history of how the program came to be in Seattle, because it is such a unique program, and the Reform Coalition that brought it into existence was unique. So we wanted to sort of document that for people in the future. We also wanted to sort of highlight some of the impacts of the program that it's had in the past several election cycles, which have been really noticeable, even though the program has not been in existence very long.
Fantastic. Yeah, that novelty is really impressive, especially because I don't think most people think of campaign finance as a place for innovation, but really public financing, can be that place, right? And maybe as we kind of get into this a little bit more, it'd be helpful to give just a brief summary of sort of what public financing is, so folks have kind of a baseline understanding of what we're talking about today.
Sure. So very broadly, and I suspect that most people in the audience already know this, but very broadly, public campaign finance is a solution to the problem of money in politics. So as we all know, elections in the US, national, state, and local, are financed by private individuals, businesses, right? So private interests that give money to campaigns to finance the elections of candidates running for political office. If we look at national elections, we see some persistent patterns. One of those persistent patterns is that the people who finance American elections are very concentrated. So in 2016, about half of 1% of the American population gave a donation over $200. That half of 1% provided about 70% of the money in federal elections, right? So the donor class is very, very concentrated. It's a very small slice of the American population. And we know also that the people within the donor class, they don't look like average Americans, and they don't look like average voters. They tend to be much older. They tend to be much wealthier. They're more educated. They also tend to be predominantly white. There are more men who make these kinds of significant campaign contributions. So it's a very small, and we would say unrepresentative slice of the population that funds elections. So public campaign financing allows candidates to run for office, whether that be national, state, or local office, using public money. And there are different ways that we can take public money, so this would be taxpayer funds, and get it to political candidates running for office. In the past, there's primarily been two types of programs that have been tried in the United States that are very widespread and probably pretty well known at this point. The first type of system was a grants-based system. And a grants-based public campaign finance system, candidates would be provided with either a partial or a full grant to run their election campaigns. So after they qualify for their program, they would get a lump sum check to get their campaign off the ground. So to run those advertisements, to send mailers to folks, to pay campaign staff, right? Those sorts of expenses. The second type of program that has been tried and is very widespread in the US is the matching fund system. That's the kind of public campaign finance system we have where I live in New York City. And the way that works is it sort of incentivizes and magnifies the impact of small dollar donors. So if you make a contribution up to a certain limit, the contribution is then matched with public monies that supplements that contribution and makes that contribution worth more money. Both of these are ways of actually getting public money into the hands of candidates who are running for office, allowing them to sort of fundraise either on a sort of wider swath of the public, or to free them up from fundraising entirely in the case of a grants-based system.
Fantastic. And yeah, and I think the key piece here, right, as you mentioned it briefly, was, you do have to qualify. You can't just be anybody who shows up at the city clerk's office or at the ethics commission and says, oh, give me the public dollars, I'm going to run this campaign. It's, there's a number of steps you have to take in order to do that.
Absolutely.
So, thinking through that process, right, thinking about what we're looking at today, right now, let's get into Seattle a little more, in depth. I would love to hear sort of what your take is on why was Seattle like the right spot for this? What made Seattle ready for not just public financing, but like a totally novel program?
Yeah. Yeah. So to sort of really think about the role of Seattle in this, I think we need to step back about 10 years to November 2015, right, when the Honest Elections initiative won on the ballot in Seattle. So that's Honest Elections, which we talk about in the book, is the ballot initiative that leads to democracy vouchers and other things around this time. So what made it sort of ripe for Seattle at that time? The story we tell in the book sort of has two big parts to it. I think one is thinking about Seattle as a city. If we think a little more about the history of Seattle and kind of progressive political innovation in Seattle, it's a city that has a long history, and a history that we talk about in the book about political innovation, right? About progressive ideas coming to life around fair wages, right? More recently, reforms around the gig economy. So there is a kind of progressive history in Seattle that made that city ripe for this kind of innovation. It's one of the, I think, big challenges of thinking about how we would expand this program to other cities, is to think about whether we can replicate sort of the political climate of Seattle, or the political climate of Seattle 2015, where city legislators are really ready to take on a big problem and put forward an innovative program and sort of iterate as they go along. That's been a huge part of sort of what's happened in Seattle, is the Elections and Ethics Commission has been sort of responding each election cycle to what they see going on the ground. So it's really been a work in progress. And I think sort of kudos to Seattle and to the political climate in Seattle, to the administrators of Seattle, for sort of creating the space for this kind of program to exist. So there's something unique about Seattle for sure. I think the other piece that we need to sort of draw in is that there was 2 years earlier in 2013, there was a ballot initiative, Proposition 1, which was basically a matching funds program, the kind that Jen just spoke about. And that proposition lost really narrowly on the ballot box in November of 2013. And as the advocates sort of regrouped, trying to figure out what to do next, it was right around the time that the idea around democracy vouchers, Larry Lessig's book, had sort of started to circulate. Larry Lessig had given a talk in Seattle. And so you had a sort of coalition that was rebounding from a big political loss and thinking about what they could do to move forward. And this idea had been sort of circulating, and they decided to adopt it. So that's the other piece I think that's kind of interesting and exciting about the Seattle story, is that it actually comes out of a political loss in 2013 to regroup and actually try something different.
Yeah, and I feel like that really resonates with a lot of these efforts, right, for reform, where it's like, what is the catalyzing, event, or what's the thing that keeps something going, that gets people excited about doing something novel?
Yeah, absolutely. And acknowledging, I think, that there is a problem to be solved in Seattle specifically, but in local elections generally. And it's a problem, that Jen spoke about kind of in broader terms, but that local elections are being funded by a very small number of donors, right? And they tend to be wealthier donors, and they tend to be concentrated in wealthier neighborhoods. Sort of in the lead up to Jen and I working on this project, we did an analysis of the political donations in Seattle in the election year prior to democracy voucher. So looking at 2013, and we see this real spatial concentration of donors, right? That 25% of the money is collected from just 10% of the neighborhoods, that just 20% of the donors who are giving $500 or more are making up more than half of the money that's going to local candidates. And there's something really important about a small number of donors in a city, right, giving to candidates and questions around the kind of access that they have or the kind of influence that they have. And so as we embarked on this project, right, a lot of work had been done on national politics and sort of national campaign contributions, but it's a different beast at the local level. And that was part of what I think the people of Seattle wanted to address, that money was extremely concentrated among a small group of wealthy donors that, as Jen said, were not representative of right voters or residents of Seattle. And it really matters at the local level in a different way because of the way that local politics operates, because of the way that city council operates. So that I think was sort of a big part of the problem that Seattle set out to solve.
Awesome. Well, I mean, thinking about that in terms of just like, we have these catalyzing events, a matching program that loses, that's one thing that kind of pushes folks towards maybe this other model. What were other reasons that Seattle might have adopted or like gone for this novel model as opposed to, trying to do the matching funds thing again or to try something else that had already been tried before?
Yeah. So I think that part of the story is what Brian already said about this reform effort that took place in 2013. That ballot measure failed by something like 1,000 votes. So it was a very slim margin, and it kind of propelled this coalition to keep working on it. We did some interviews for the book project to sort of piece together the history of how this program came to be. And one of the things that some of the coalition members told us was that they knew at the time when they were rethinking how to move forward with public campaign financing in Seattle that democracy vouchers was actually polling better among Seattleites than the matching funds program. So there was more kind of like grassroots support for something more transformative, which goes back to what Brian was saying about Seattle being kind of a unique place for a program of this type to take root, because there is this kind of strong history of a progressive political culture, a very involved citizenry in Seattle, very high participation rates. But more theoretically, I think that the voucher program, when they were having this conversation in Seattle, even though the programs that have been tried around the US before, like the grant system, the matching fund system, they both have their virtues, right? The grant system, we know, frees up candidate time to potentially interact with constituents because candidates are getting a lump sum to finance their campaigns, right? The matching fund system also incentivizes candidates to go out and get small dollar donations. And the hope is that the people who are giving these small dollar donations are more representative of their future constituents, of voters in general. But the kind of the really special part of the democracy voucher program is that it puts money, democracy vouchers, in the hands of all voters, right? And in fact, in Seattle, it's all residents, because even if you're not a voter, you can still participate in the program. And what that does from the perspective of the candidate is it opens up this wide kind of sea of money for them to go out and talk to their future constituents and collect democracy vouchers. So it incentivizes candidates in a real way to get out there and interact with voters, get the vouchers from voters, knock on doors, right? Have the kind of campaign that I think many of us in our heads, when we're thinking about political campaigns, we think of a candidate kind of going around and talking to constituents and voters and getting a sense of the community that they're going to represent later. That is not what often happens in our political campaigns and contemporary US politics. And this program actually provides a way forward for campaigns to look more like that, for candidates to go out, talk to everyday constituents, solicit, get voucher donations, and finance their campaigns from voters who, come from all walks of life. So it's a really unique way to do public campaign financing. It directly incentivizes participation by voters, and it directly incentivizes candidates to go out and talk to those voters.
Yeah, and I think that's really helpful actually in terms of thinking about those like big donors, right? The ideal situation is we have candidates out there, pounding the pavement, knocking on doors, talking with constituents, and public financing, certainly with the voucher program, as well as the others, really incentivizes them to be out there and combining their campaign fundraising with their campaign messaging, right? But that's very different from from raising money from billionaires, which I feel like is what we have been used to, right? You mentioned earlier that in 2016, you could look at all those numbers and say, most of this money is just coming from a wealthy few folks, right? And I'm curious, is that the same, would we say that's the same in Seattle, where, prior to the program, you'd say, those kinds of national trends were similar at the local level?
Yeah, I think Brian already pointed out some of these facts and figures from Seattle pre-democracy voucher program, but conveniently, Brian and I had done an analysis of pre-democracy voucher Seattle in an earlier published work, and we looked at sort of both the spatial concentration of donations and just what we call the fundraising coalitions of city council and mayoral candidates in Seattle look like. And what we found was that in Seattle, before the program in 2013, it was about 1% of voters that made a donation of any size, not just a donation over $200, a donation of any size. So a tiny share of the Seattle electorate is actually participating through this method. And again, what we found was similar to national elections. We had a small core of folks who were giving larger amounts who were providing the lion's share of money to city council and mayoral candidates. So the numbers were city council candidates raised something like 40% of their funds from people who had given more than $500. And bear in mind that before the program began, Seattle had pretty stringent contribution limits. And even still, we saw this kind of concentration in the donor pool. In mayoral elections, it was even more concentrated. So it was actually high dollar donors were the majority of funds in mayoral races. So people who were giving at or near the maximum were providing actually the majority of funds to mayoral candidates in that election cycle. And again, as Brian said, the folks who were funding these elections were not living in all kind of city council districts across the city. They were really concentrated in the wealthiest neighborhoods of Seattle. So these were folks who, probably homeowners, have, maybe have waterfront views, and they're concentrated in a small number of neighborhoods. So similar patterns to what we see in national elections in Seattle before the democracy voucher program began, both in terms of small core of people who are actually participating. They tend to be very concentrated and in the wealthiest neighborhoods.
So I do think your book really does go into the details, right, about how the program changed, right, who makes a contribution, right? And I was hoping you could talk a bit about why is that important?
Yeah. So Aaron, there are a couple ways that Jen and I have kind of thought about the changing group of donors. And let me share kind of broad patterns that we see. So the first one is thinking about just the number of donors, right? As Jen mentioned, fewer than 1% of Seattle residents were giving a donation before democracy vouchers. And so one of the goals of the program was to say, could we get actually more people involved in the process of campaign finance, right? Can we draw people into sort of giving to candidates and using the vouchers as a way to express preferences? That's pretty healthy for democracy, we think, right? So it shouldn't necessarily be that people are just voting on election day, but if we can get them involved early, if candidates are knocking on their doors to collect vouchers, if people are paying a little bit more attention earlier on to elections, then we think we have a much more engaged citizenry. And so that's the first measure that we see. And this really is, I think, one of the more remarkable trends of the democracy voucher program. The percentage of Seattle residents that are participating in the campaign finance system, it goes up in 2017, it goes up in 2021. It declines a little bit in 2023 when there's not a mayoral election, but But even so, when we compare it to sort of other cities across the country, the share of Seattle residents that are giving, using their democracy vouchers and therefore giving money in the political process is above every other city. So just in terms of absolute numbers, we're seeing an increase. Now, sort of to give you a kind of balanced perspective, it's still a relatively small share of the electorate, right? You have, depending on the election, sort of 40, 50% of people voting in local elections, and somewhere, again, depending on the election, between 5, 7, 8% of people giving democracy vouchers, right? So that's one way that we thought about it. And I think the program has been absolutely a success in terms of increasing the number of people participating. The second way that we've thought about it is thinking about representation, right? So do the people that are giving democracy vouchers actually look more like the voters in Seattle or the residents in Seattle, right? So is the sort of pool of campaign contributors actually representative of the people that live in Seattle? And to do this in the book, we compare sort of cash donors, democracy voucher users, and we compare them to voters or to the electorate. And the democracy voucher users are not perfectly representative of the electorate, but they're much more representative than cash donors are. So we are seeing a sort of move towards a set of donors that are more representative of the people of Seattle. And then the third way that we're thinking about it is in terms of renewal, right? So one of our concerns in local elections is the same set of people contributing every election cycle, right? And you have this built-in class of donors that becomes just the sort of funding mechanism for mayoral races or council races. And one of the things that we find, and I think this was one of the more surprising findings to me, is we see quite a bit of renewal each election cycle, which is to say it's not the same people that are using their democracy vouchers every election cycle. And in fact, over the 3 election cycles that we study in the book, it's more common that people participated in only 1 or 2 than participated in all 3 of the election cycles that we're studying. So you're seeing sort of, I think the story emerges of people being interested in particular races or maybe in particular years or issues matter to them. And they're able to sort of engage when they want to because they have these vouchers, right? And so we're seeing this sort of somewhat common turnover as people are using democracy vouchers. So as we sort of went through the data, those were the buckets that we were looking at. Did the number of people grow or change over time? Were the donors more representative of the electorate? And were we seeing sort of this renewal where each election cycle kind of different people were participating in the program?
All right. Do you mind if I just add one little thing? So I just wanted to mention that we did this analysis about participation, representation, and renewal for voters, which was an important part of our story. And then we also looked at candidates as well. And I think that in the book, we do some initial kind of descriptive analyses of how the candidate pool may be changing as the program matures. Those numbers are, subject to change because the program is still relatively new and we need some more data on a few election cycles. But broadly, we can say a couple of things about how the program may also be impacting things on the candidate side. One is we know from a study of 2 economists at University of Washington that the program has made Seattle's elections much more competitive. So there are far more candidates running in Seattle's city council races now than before the program. So it's widening the candidate pool. And then the second thing I would say is from our, again, initial descriptive analyses, because we only had 3 cycles at the time you were writing the book, it did look like the candidate pool for city council and mayoral elections were becoming more gender diverse. So a higher percentage of women running for city council and for mayor. And we also saw an uptick in candidates of color running for mayoral office. So as well as actually the mean age of candidates decreased slightly for both city council and mayoral races. So this suggests that these 2 things, right, that changing who is financing elections is happening in tandem with and goes hand in hand with changing the people who are running and winning in Seattle's elections. So that gives me some hope that one of the effects of this program may be that we get a wider pool of candidates, and we get people who look more like voters running and actually winning for office and representing their constituents.
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, no, I would add too. I mean, if we think about this from the side of candidates, right? This sort of changes the way a candidate or a potential candidate might think about whether or not they want to run for office, right? No longer do you need a sort of Rolodex of wealthy donors in Seattle, right? You know that everybody in Seattle has $100 to spend. You know that whatever your core constituency or the group you're going after is, and that I do think was one of the goals of the program, right? To think about could we incentivize sort of a different set of people, different kinds of candidates who might be excluded from running for office because of the high barrier to entry. And this, as we think about the program beyond just Seattle or just beyond just city councils, that could be a really important part of the spread of the program, is that the barriers to entry into running for public office are really high, and potentially a program like this lowers the barriers to entry.
Yeah, I love that connection, right? Because we can, and when we think about who like the typical donor is and who the typical candidate is, right? On average, right? It's the whiter, wealthier folks, and taking down the barriers. It clearly, as your book shows, that allows more people to come in from those groups that are historically underrepresented, right?
Yeah. And I think, one of the challenges as folks think about expanding this beyond Seattle, we've sometimes joked that the political class in Seattle is just sort of various types of liberal, right? So are we, right? So sort of how wide is the political spectrum in a place like Seattle? And this may be an interesting program to sort of think about in a place where the political spectrum is a little bit wider, right? And if it incentivizes different kinds of candidates in cities or in states or in competitive races where, right, the political spectrum looks a little wider than it does in Seattle.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to more places adopting vouchers, both for the democracy aspects, but also these sort of like inclusion and representation aspects that we can see how it kind of works out as we move from one place to the next. I think that maybe this is a good time, as we've talked about all these successes, this might be a good time to talk about maybe some of the challenges that you see for, either how the program has worked so far, or, challenges you see coming down the line. I know you talk a little bit about them in the book, but I would love to hear, any ones that you want to highlight, in particular, that you think might be useful as folks are thinking through, like, oh, is this the right place or is this the right program for where I live?
Yeah, sure. So I'll take a first pass, and then Brian, I'm sure I'll forget things, so you should feel free to jump in. But one of the things that we talk about in the book in terms of challenges is the problem of independent expenditures, right? And this is a problem that's not unique to Seattle. We just had a national election in which we saw super PACs playing a very large role in some competitive races, dumping hundreds of millions of dollars into national elections. So one of the concerns in Seattle, and it's important to mention here that the tax levy that funds the program is actually up for renewal now in 2025. And so this debate has been brought back to life in Seattle, and they're now reconsidering the voucher program, after having had it for almost five local election cycles. And one of the big things is independent expenditures, and whether the program is directly sort of pulling in more of this outside money as democracy vouchers have provided a counterweight to the influence of the wealthy, right? So is it sort of, the outside money is coming in as a result of the program because the program has so empowered people who normally don't have a big voice in these election processes. So we look at independent expenditures in the book, and we do see an increase in IEs, independent expenditures in Seattle. Again, it's not unique to Seattle, but it does seem that it's more pronounced there. My speculation in the book, and my speculation still, is that part of what may be going on in Seattle is that the program has been, as I said before, really effective at increasing competition for local seats, right? City council in particular, there are just many more people running. If we look around the nation at where super PACs, so super PACs are independent expenditure only committees, where super PACs are spending their money, they're going to spend them in competitive elections because they may have a chance to actually influence the outcome there. So my sense is that some of what is happening in Seattle in terms of the increase in IEs is actually a result of the increased competition that they're getting in local races. The local races in Seattle used to be very sleepy. Not many people were running for them. And now I think the number of candidates has, I think, almost doubled in city council races. So a lot more interest, more competition for those seats. And as a consequence, I think probably more IEs. But IEs do sort of undermine the intent of the program, which is to keep out, or not keep out, but to have elections that are not solely funded by these kind of wealthy donors as well as interest groups. So Seattle's kind of weighing those two things at the moment, IEs versus the impact of the program. Brian, what did I forget?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, two other challenges that come to mind. One is a political challenge. As Jen mentioned, this is the final year of the original sort of 10 years for the democracy voucher, and the mayor has proposed extending the program, at a cost of about $12 per homeowner in a tax assessment, right? So there is a cost associated with the program. And I think especially in sort of today's austerity environment, this has to be a program that has the political muscle and political support behind it to sort of make it through the budget process. So I do think that there are political challenges and will be in cities where there's competition for how to spend tax dollars, right? And sort of convincing voters and legislators that this is worthwhile. I know in DC a couple of years ago, there was a conversation about a matching program. And we ended up having a matching program that looks like a pretty standard program across the country. But the mayor raised a lot of questions about whether or not sort of matching program and the money it was going to take to create a matching program in DC was sort of worth it when the city was, struggling with a budget and fighting other social challenges in the city. And eventually they agreed to a matching program, but at some cost. So I think that there's a political challenge. And the other, and I think this is a place where Seattle has really excelled, and for other places that are sort of looking to mimic what's going on in Seattle, as I mentioned earlier, the Seattle Elections and Ethics Commission has been really outstanding about sort of evaluating what worked and for the next cycle, sort of updating the program, right? So thinking about things like how vouchers are collected or who can collect the vouchers, sort of how residents can submit them, right, online or as paper vouchers. Sort of what are some of the limits of the program, right? How much can candidates spend? Raising the limits when a candidate who's not using the voucher program is spending even more to put the voucher program, the voucher candidate at a disadvantage. And so Seattle has been very good at sort of paying attention to those and sort of iterating as they go along. And I think that's the other piece of this for places looking to adopt a new program, is to sort of foresee what some of those challenges might be, and to sort of be willing to be creative and to adapt as they move forward in administering the program. So one, I think, is a political challenge of sort of getting it up, and the other is an administrative challenge of knowing that this kind of new program needs, right, some flexibility as it moves forward.
Yeah, I feel like this conversation really highlights how like the details do matter, right?
Sure.
We're talking about like really important pieces, right? What's the IE environment, right? The independent expenditures that folks are bringing in from out of, with outside spenders. How and then looking at the program itself, like what are the mechanics, right? And how are those working, to help candidates, to help contributors? I feel like that's really important. but it can also be, tough to take time to actually sort through what these issues are, because it really is detailed.
Yeah.
Jen, did you have something to add?
Oh, I was just going to quickly add, I think you're absolutely right, Aaron. And one of the things that we learned about Seattle when we were doing the history chapter is that they thought long and hard about all of these details before the program was implemented. They had some background studies about how much their races cost, right? How much the average donation was. So when they were first kind of conceiving the program, they had some baseline estimates of what it would take, how much it would cost to fund it, what would be a reasonable denomination for the democracy vouchers, all of these kinds of mechanics that actually do really affect how the program works and how people kind of interact with it. So the devil's in the details with the democracy voucher program, but luckily we have a really solid model in Seattle that we can potentially bring to other municipalities.
Fantastic. And it really brings to mind that like laboratories of democracy idea, right? Usually we think about it in states, but I think in general, anytime you can have like a local program or a state program, these are all opportunities to innovate, to create something new, to try something new in a new place.
Yeah.
That's great. I think at this point, we probably should turn to questions from our audience today. Make sure we get those in. And then, once we have some of those, I know there are some in the comments. So we'll turn those to you guys, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, so our first question from Tumalo. While democracy vouchers aim to increase political participation, how do you ensure they do not disproportionately benefit well-organized interest groups or candidates with existing political influence, thereby reinforcing existing power structures rather than democratizing campaign financing?
Yeah, so I can take a first crack at that question. So from the experience in Seattle, the first thing that sort of really comes to mind is that the Seattle Elections and Ethics Commission translated democracy voucher material into, I don't know the exact number of languages, but I can remember 20 languages. Thank you. I can remember Jen and I being at their offices and sort of getting and seeing, right, the same material printed in 20 different languages. And I think that's one thing that they did really well, right, is to sort of recognize communities that were historically disenfranchised from the political process and make sure that material was available in those languages. And with that, I think the other thing that they did really well is to work with, and especially as time went on, to work with different community groups to make sure that kind of groups that were already existing in local communities were advocating on behalf of of the program, making sure that people knew how to use their democracy vouchers, scheduling events at community centers and libraries. Right, we have a long list of all the events that different community groups were putting on with the Seattle Elections and Ethics Commission. So that was something that I think that they were really sort of paying very close attention to, exactly for this reason, right? One of the things that we don't want is for sort of those who already participate just to have another way to participate, right? I mean, of course, we want them to participate this way, but a big goal of the program was to make sure that this reached different kinds of communities, right? And that people who may not otherwise have participated in the political process had a way to do so. So those are sort of two big ways that I think that Seattle made sure that they were reaching out to groups that were kind of historically marginalized from the political process.
Yeah, and I feel like that highlights, right, both it's an access issue, making sure people can be a part of the program, and then it's also an outreach issue, which if I remember right, you were talking about how like contributions only came from a couple different districts in Seattle, and now the contributions come from all over Seattle, right? It's every district, right? And I feel like that really speaks to that issue.
Yeah, I think that's right. And especially sort of as an urbanist, right? One of the things that I care a lot about is thinking about the geographic sort of spread or concentration of things that are happening in the city. And it's very clear in Seattle, right, as it is in other cities where you have sort of less wealthy neighborhoods or neighborhoods that are marginalized within the city, and making sure that there is outreach in those communities. And in part because a lot of the work that a city council does or that a city does in budgeting and resource allocation is about geographic distribution of things and resources, right? And that's one of the reasons why it matters so much that there is widespread neighborhood involvement, right? That there are advocates in different neighborhoods, because geography matters a lot in the city.
I just want to add one kind of point about the rules of the program. So in terms of, I think the question also asked about interest groups using the system to their benefit. And we know that can and does sometimes happen in matching funds programs, especially like in New York City. We used, I don't want to get the details of the New York State program wrong, but essentially you could bundle matching funds contributions. So even though they were small dollar contributions, you could they could be sent through an intermediary who would then like funnel them to a candidate. And so this opened the door for interest groups to play a bigger role in channeling these these small dollar donations to candidates. In Seattle, that is actually not allowed. So these vouchers go to voters. Voters use them. Interest groups are not permitted to bundle in that way. So in Seattle, we have some real provisions to keep that kind of like interest group influence from creeping into the voucher allocation process. And then I also wanted to add on the candidate side, another part of the question was asking about, maybe this is like an incumbent protection program where essentially it's the people who already know how to run for office, already have the wealthy networks. It's very easy to translate that machinery to running with democracy vouchers. And what we found we actually have talked to a lot of candidates who have run on democracy vouchers. And also the study that I referred to earlier by these economists is that the percentage of incumbents running for re-election has declined after the program was implemented. So to me, that signals that incumbents are actually looking at this wider field of candidates that are competitive and deciding that they would rather not run. So it's not the case that this is just making it easier for incumbents to raise money. It's actually producing more turnover of candidates and incumbents. And then again, there are provisions to keep the interest group influence from becoming a big part of how democracy vouchers are channeled.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I like how, thinking through that, right, the process year over year or election cycle over election cycle means you're going to get new ideas or new candidates. Like that's actually what we want. We don't, it's certainly there are those representatives who have been in office for 40 years and some of them, we really love having them there, but sometimes it is, good to get somebody new in and this just seems to create, an opportunity for that.
Yeah. So the candidates that we've talked to have signaled that running with democracy vouchers is a lot different than running in the private kind of cash system. And it's not clear to me that I just read this article about the Democratic caucus and divisions within Congress along lines of age. I don't think that Chuck Schumer would necessarily have an easy time translating his campaign machinery to running on democracy vouchers. I think it kind of involves a different fundraising strategy.
Excellent. Well, I think we've done that question, so maybe we can go to the next one. All right, the next question from Mary is, vouchers is a great first step. Is the strategy to start at the local level and then move to states and then federal elections? Can different levels have different funding? I would love to hear what you guys think about sort of what's the prognosis? Where do we go from here? How do we see this scaling up?
Well, I'll be blunt. We don't see it scaling up to national elections anytime soon because of the political climate. One of the things we talk about in the book is, Seattle is a very democratic, liberal city. We think that's probably a big part of the reason that Seattle was able to adopt this program. If you look at the municipalities that are adopting any kind of public campaign financing, it's not exclusively places that tend to lean Democratic, but I would say probably more so than Republican. Campaign finance and public campaign finance in particular has become a very partisan issue, which was not true 20 years ago, but it is true now. And for that reason, I think that the prospects of a national program at the moment are probably pretty dim, although there was a provision in the For the People Act, which was passed by the House in 2021, but then stalled in the Senate. There was a provision for a pilot voucher program, but of course that never came to be. At the state level, I think there's more promise there and potentially more movement. I've talked to some folks across the country, state legislators that are thinking about this program for their state elections. So far, it hasn't happened, but I think that there are conversations ongoing about this. And then there's a lot of movement at the local level, in particular on the West Coast. There are a number of grassroots campaigns taking shape to bring democracy vouchers to different places in California. So I think that's probably the next frontier before we get a state or even a national program. Brian, do you have thoughts you want to?
No, I agree. I mean, I think that cities often provide the kind of political opening that would be much more rare in national politics. I mean, when Senator Gillibrand from New York ran for president in 2016 or 2020, she had proposed a sort of similar kind of program, and it didn't sort of take off, but it was part of a national conversation at least. I think thinking about cities as laboratories of democracy, as we've talked about, the opportunity to find kind of individual legislators that are excited about this kind of proposal, and sort of start to encourage them in that way. That feels like the way that this kind of program catches on, is at sort of across municipalities, across cities, somewhere where it's less expensive to fund, and we can see sort of real results, and then it taking off from there. So I imagine to the extent that it grows from here, it grows across kind of progressive cities, it grows across other cities, and it scales up from there. But as Jen said, I don't think we're in a political environment nationally where this is sort of a feasible national program.
Yeah, and I know I've seen at least a couple state level ones where I think it's New Hampshire had a bill. They've had a bill for a number of years that's been focused on trying to bring some version of democracy vouchers, right? I think they used a different name for it, but a version of that to their state elections. So that's been interesting to see, how people are thinking about the different ways they can incorporate it into their own proposals.
Yeah.
One just very final thought is that one of the things that I've heard in discussions about these programs is that it's not the case that democracy vouchers has to be a standalone program. We could think of hybrid models where we have matching funds plus a democracy vouchers model, or maybe grants plus democracy vouchers. I think that's a kind of a natural fit. So there are different ways to kind of mold the program to make it fit different places.
Yeah. And as Jen says that, I think one of the challenges for local legislators is to think about, what is the goal of a municipal campaign finance program or a reform? So, when we were talking about it in DC, one of the questions is if your goal in changing the campaign finance system is to amplify the amount, the sort of contributions of existing donors, right? If you think that the kind of existing donor pool is adequate, but we really want to amplify those $10 donations, then maybe a matching program makes a lot of sense, right? If your goal is actually to increase the number of people that are contributing, right, the findings of that matching programs don't really do that, right? Because to be involved in a matching program, you have to have your own money to give, right? Private money to give. Whereas the voucher program, right, gives public money to everybody in the city. So I think sort of going back and thinking about these kinds of hybrid programs, we're probably at a place where we can think, or legislators can think about, what is the goal of changing a program? Is it to amplify small dollar donors? Is it to create broader access? And sort of depending on that, can figure out the right blend of hybrid program.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's see if we got one more. Do we have one more question coming? We do. Okay. One more from Joe. Is Seattle's Democracy Voucher Program documentation available online?
Yeah, it sure is. I've referenced a couple of times the Seattle Elections and Ethics Commission, or Ethics and Elections Commission, SEEC, and they have all of the program documentation.
Brian, ethics always come before elections.
Ethics always come before elections. Wow. Jen and I have been working on this project for almost a decade, and this is the first time that she's given me sort of that nugget to hold on to. Seattle Ethics and Elections Commission. You can find their program documentation on there. So they'll have information about the program history. They have some of the data that's available. There are a number of reports that Jen and I have done that are on Jen's website. There are a number of reports that the SEEC has commissioned that are available on their website. So they do a really nice job of making material available.
Yeah, I just want to add on a little bit and say that all of the Seattle program documentation is available online. They also in Seattle have a fantastic portal that you can go on and do your own little analyses of the contributions and democracy vouchers in each election. And they overall are excellent at providing data transparently. So yes.
Well, and that's very helpful, because I think we started when I was doing a little bit of table setting where, from 1972, the demand was more transparency in election spending, right? And one of the key things about the Seattle program and all these public financing programs is you can see all that money, where it's coming from and where it's going, right? It's just particularly unique in Seattle, where you get to see every single one of those democracy vouchers and where it went.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Excellent. All right. Well, I think we've had an hour that just screamed by here, but I would love to hear if any final thoughts that you have, Jen and Brian. I would love to hear those as we wrap up here. Or did we say it all?
We probably didn't say it all. One thing I'll just say is final thoughts. Again, I have all of the policy reports and academic papers that Brian and I have worked on over the years available on my website. So anybody who's interested in reading about the details of the program can go on and download it. They're all public access. So that's one thing. Another thing, I just wanted to come back to the other cities that are considering this program. As I said, a couple in California. Oakland did actually pass a measure to bring democracy vouchers to Oakland, California, which I think would actually be really exciting, because Oakland is such a, it's a big city, it's diverse, all of these other things. But at the moment, it has been caught up in kind of a budgetary battle. As Brian pointed to, it's become very contentious how we're going to use every single dollar of Oakland's taxpayer money. So there is potentially a second program that will come online in the next couple of years. And then again, there's some movement at in localities in California to watch out for.
I would just, I guess my final reminder is that ethics come before elections. Our takeaway for everybody on this Zoom. No, only that, the Jen and I have been able to sort of scratch the surface of the history of the program. I think it was one of the really exciting things in writing the book is not just the history of sort of how the program developed in Seattle, but also the kind of intellectual history of an idea, right? And how does a sort of idea that emerged long ago in legal scholarship sort of translate into an actual policy on the ground now, a decade into it. So if I have a an additional sell for the book, and something that we weren't able to share here, but that I think is a really exciting part of the story. It's also that intellectual history of an idea.
Awesome. Thank you both. And I'll just, for the benefit of our folks here, I'll just share the book one more time. Then the book is Democracy Vouchers and the Promise of Fairer Elections in Seattle. And the authors are Jen Heerwig and Brian McCabe. Thank you both for being here for this excellent discussion, for scratching the surface of what you've got. There's so many more details in the book. And now I get to think about how ethics always comes before elections going forward.
Thank you for having us.